Okay, we are back. Yeah, we are still dealing with the drama of the fly that's flying around here. So it's anyway, way it goes sometimes. So for our next session, we're going to be looking now at some of the principal Jewish texts as that I think relate to conscientious objection. And it's a little bit of a stretch, but I don't think it's too much of one. Before we do that, I will mention that after this presentation, I am going to be sharing via email a little bit later tonight. I have some outline that I used for today that will have citations to a lot of the things mentioned in the presentation today. It just needs a little more editing, so I'm going to clean it up a little before I send that out to y'all. But also for these texts, I'll be sharing that as well. We also sending you a copy of the book Wrestling with Conscience, a guide to Jewish conscientious objectors, an ebook version of it that was published by the Jewish Peace Fellowship a few years ago. It's a little bit out of date, but it's right now still the best resource available on Jewish conscientious objection. So we'll be keep an eye out for your emails after this, the emails that you registered for the Zoom session. If for some reason that's not a good email to email you on, though, go ahead and drop your email in the chat or contact me afterwards so I can send you the information that way as well. So anyway, so let's go ahead. Let me pull up. Document ready. We're going to be looking at, where is it? There we go. I had little problems being on a different computer than I was expecting, so getting everything on the right computer. So we got it now. And take just one moment for this to open, and then we can go ahead and do screen share. Okay. Okay, I won't do screen share right now, so I can get that to work right. So we'll just do it this way.
Wait, I think can you maybe put the document or link or something in the chat, and then I can help screen share?
Oh, yeah. Let's see. That's a great idea. Well, the problem is I was having a problem getting the document open is the problem. Let's see, that may be.
Even if you just email it or something to me quick.
Okay. Oh, sure. Let's do this right now. I want to do this on Safaria for now for this first reading, and then I'll figure out for the others after that. Screen share. Okay, so this text is in the book of Deuteronomy, which remember is a recounting of sorts of the Torah, a retelling in some ways of the Torah. And this is a section where we're seeing some instruction specifically on the subject of warfare. So it begins. When you, an Israelite warrior, take the field against your enemies and see horses and chariots, forces larger than yours, have no fear of them, for your God, Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh, who brought you from the land of Egypt, is with you. Before you join battle, the priest shall come forward and address the troops. He shall say to them, Hear, O Israel, you are about to join battle with your enemy. Let not your courage falter. Do not be in fear or in panic or in dread of them. For it is your God, Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh, who marches with you to do battle for you against your enemy to bring you victory. Then the official shall address the troops as follows. Is there anyone who has built a new house but has not dedicated it? Let him go back to his home, lest he die in battle and another dedicate it. Is there anyone who has planted a vineyard but has never harvested it? let him go back to his home, lest he die in battle and another harvest it. Is there anyone who has paid the bride price for a wife, but who has not yet taken her into his household? Let him go back to his home, lest he die in battle, and another take her into his household as his wife. The official shall go on, addressing the troops, and say, is there anyone afraid and disheartened? Let him go back to his home, lest the courage of his comrades flag like his. Now that verse 8 is the key here, because it is discussing basically the framework of draft law exemptions under their legal code. These 4 categories, 3 of them related to men who having done these things that are seen as markers of entering into adulthood, or of entering into society, and of saying that people who have done this but yet haven't yet been able to enjoy the benefits of it, they should get an exemption. But then there's this other exemption for the afraid and disheartened. Well, in Hebrew, and I will warn you, I'm not a Hebrew expert, minimal fluency, but I know how to use some of the good reference tools out there. The key words in chapter 20, verse 8 are Heare, Verek, Hal, Vav, which again is translated here as, let's see how they say it. It says, afraid and disheartened. But I think a better way of translating it would be fearful, tender hearts, because that last word is about the heart. The front word is fear. The question is that middle word. And I think of all the ways you could translate that, if you look at some of the other synonyms given in some of the dictionaries, they talk about softness, delicateness, tenderness. And so I think the best way to convey this in English would be to say tender-hearted people, soft-hearted people. In other words, what this text is speaking about is speaking of disposition more than an immediate state of mind. Now, the fearful part at the beginning, you might see that as tied to state of mind in an immediate context, but the rest of it seems to be more about disposition, someone's personality. Now, as you can imagine, the Jewish community, we have wrestled with this as well as everything else in Torah over and over again. And so let's look a little bit at how some future generations would interpret the text. The next text I have to read is from the Mishnah, which is the first written recording of oral traditions, what we today call the Oral Torah. And this was put together starting around the 3rd century CE. So here's what the Mishnah says about this text. Oh, and by the way, this is, I believe, in Talmud Sota. No, that's not right. I'll have to double check on the citation, but anyway, this
well,
is
wait, what's the Talmud citation? Because if you give me that, I'll be able to find the Mishnah citation.
Looks like Jerusalem Talmud Sota 8.9.1.
Okay.
So it says the policeman, and I think that word they translate policeman, I think might also be translated as official, but shall add and say to the people, who is the man fearful and faint-hearted? Let him go and return to his house. Rabbi Akiva says, fearful and faint-hearted in its simple meaning that he cannot stand in military engagements and see a drawn sword. Rabbi Yosei, the Galilean, says, fearful and faint-hearted is one who is fearful because of his sins. Therefore, the Torah apprehended him to all of these that he should return because of them. Rabbi Yosei said, a widow for the high priest, a divorcee, or one having received halisah for an ordinary Cohen, a bastard or Gibeonite girl for an Israeli, a Jewish girl for a bastard or a Gibeonite. That is the, quote, fearful and faint-hearted. This passage in the Mishnah is one example of several I found in other sources of this era that discuss the idea of there being 2 primary ways of interpreting this text. One, that the fearful are exempted because they are afraid of war itself, or the other category being that the fearful are exempted not because they are afraid of war, but rather because of unaddressed sin that could harm themselves or the mission.
James, we're still seeing the Deuteronomy passage.
Oh, okay.
Just want to make sure if we can.
Okay, so let me go in. Thank you. Some commentators also speak of Scripture showing a kind of mercy to sinners because of this instruction being placed in the context of other draft exemptions. In other words, the idea that if someone is fearful of going to war because of sin, that they need to make teshuvah for, might repent of, that we don't want to embarrass them. So we put these other categories so people might assume they're going home because they built a new house or because they have a new wife. So that's interesting. Now, if you look at most of the later commentaries, they continue to argue for some variation of these two theories, but more recently, two additional theories have popped up. One is that the verse's message is purely pragmatic in nature, designed to eliminate distractions that could impair battlefield morale, similar to Rabbi Akiva's position. And the best example I have of that one, I'll just read this one real quick. This was from the Torah, a women's commentary. And what it said was, quote, because of the contagious nature of cowardliness, this verse instructs the officials to remove fearful soldiers, lest they demoralize the rest of the troops. The other perspective, though, we also see, besides the idea of just it's about the contagious nature of cowardice, the other argument was that the verse is an early grudging acknowledgement of the principle of conscientious objection, which happens to benefit both the one being sent home, but also the army as a whole. I'll be upfront and say my take is the latter interpretation, that last interpretation. I do think it's obvious the compiler of the Deuteronomy text was much more concerned with pragmatic concerns than anything else. However, I think the author's use of the word soft-hearted to refer to the draftee being sent home has a bit of kindness to it, which opens up another window of possibility that maybe this is a text that's asking us to breathe more life into it, that's asking us to amplify this meaning, the meaning of the text beyond its more narrow intent. And so this is where I think we're going to move into some discussion time. Before we do that, let me check our chat real quick, see what we've had. Okay, awesome. So I think what we'll do, let's see how many folks. We have about 16. So let's do this. I'm going to break us. Let's do, I guess it's a small group. Let's not do breakout groups, but let's just go ahead and discuss for a few minutes a couple of issues. One is, what lessons does a text like this have for us today? And bear in mind, there's a lot of differences between our world and theirs. The biggie being is that they lived in a theocratic time, is what's being depicted in Deuteronomy. We don't live in that kind of world. A lot of other issues. We live in a different kind of society. But nevertheless, is there something for us in this text? Does this have something that's relevant and meaningful to us today? Secondly, do you think that the author of this text, who's using the word, talking about the soft-hearted, fearful people, is this author speaking kindly about these people or unkindly? What do we think about how the potential person seeking exemption from this draft is being characterized? So let's maybe for about 5 minutes, let's talk about that a little bit. So feel free to unmute yourself and love to hear your thoughts.
Can we screen share again just so people can be looking at it as they comment?
Sure.
I'm happy to do it if it's easier for you not to be, if you just give me permission. But
Yeah, I'll set up I'll make you co-host. And thank you so much, by the way, Lex. This really helps a lot.
Let me chime in.
Yeah.
A thought that I had is I think in terms of nowadays when we use the word divergence and saying that somebody is neurodivergent, gender divergent, we're becoming more comfortable with that phrase. And to me, this is opening the realm of an idea of divergence, that yes, there might have been a group of men, all of a certain age, and they had an eligibility to serve in the army. But this is saying that it's a recognition that they're not all the same. They're not uniform. They're not all in the same place in their life, but they're also not all in the same place in their capabilities. And it's making some room for people to be divergent and still be accepted in some way into the community.
I like that a lot.
I would also just add that I think that in the context of people who've paid a bride price for a wife, or not harvested their vineyard, that those things are not considered necessarily shameful or in some ways lesser. And so I think in the context of saying, is there anyone who is soft-hearted, is not necessarily, I think this translation maybe is indicating fear, and that there's a concern that that's going to infect, for less of a better word, other people in the troop. But I don't think it's inherently derogatory. And as a person who I have actually served in the military, and I certainly had other people around who are afraid in those situations. It can be very infectious, like any kind of thing that is, an emotional gossip, or even just somebody might try to convince another person that this is unjust, or that we should be afraid. I mean, think about the spies who saw the giants and came in and said, they're too big for us, we can't win, and all the people became afraid. So I mean, there's that concern, and so we don't want necessarily those people to be out there putting others at risk as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, I would echo what folks before me have said. Like, this really comes off as pretty neutral to me in terms of that phrasing of afraid and tenderhearted. If anything, I think like the Torah doesn't do stuff like this that much. Like, it doesn't. It feels more like Talmud here, that it's giving like these specific cases and carving out exceptions. Like, the Torah doesn't usually go into this much detail, so I just find it kind of interesting that it does. I don't really know what to do with that, but it does seem to be erring on the side of like, we really only want people going to war that like need to. Like, it seems like there is an air of like, we're going to think about all sorts of folks who don't need to, because this is something we should reserve for those who really need to. I like the spies parallel also, by the way. I think that's really that's apt, because like that's another text where we actually have like an anti-war voice in that's really an anti-war voice more than this, because you've got 10/12 of the tribes saying like we shouldn't fight. But yeah, I'm really struck by this text. Thanks for sharing it.
I did find one other modern commentary, and all of the commentaries I'll be sharing with the resource page I'll be sharing later are Jewish commentaries, except one. And I picked one from a Mennonite biblical commentary, in part because one of our hosts today is a Mennonite church, but I really liked how they framed it. So I'm going to read this little paragraph that's hits some similar themes what we've discussed, but from a little bit different angle. It says, the final question is of a different sort. Is anyone afraid or disheartened? The negative impact on morale of having people within the army who are afraid is mentioned, but again, one must ask whether this fully explains the exemption. War and the potential death that it brings produce fear in virtually all. Is it true that the passage opens with the priest assuring the people they have nothing to fear? And yet how many would not admit some fear in battle? These are now exempted. The passage does not address the question of who is left. Who actually will do the fighting? The implicit answer of the passage is clear: God. It was God who defeated Pharaoh at the Red Sea, and it is God who will now give the victory. Deuteronomy 24. So that's another take.
Yeah, that actually slightly kind of goes into my read, because I did encounter this earlier in a book I was reading, this part of Deuteronomy, and it felt like it was giving reasons and reasons, and like kind of, I don't know, like removing different populations, and then I was just imagining like, and then there's no one left, and so like no one can fight, right? It was
Yeah,
just, yeah, that at some point you'd potentially diminish your whole force.
may it be so. Um, I think, let's see who said this. Adrienne posted something I thought was really interesting. I'm hoping that maybe again someone who's Hebrew fluent can help answer this question.
It's a thrilling answer. The Lavav comes back. So the word heart is Lavav, and in the English you only see it once with disheartened. That's where it's getting at the Lavav. But Andrine, you're totally right. The word courage in English is rendering like the whole phrase, lest the courage of his comrades flag, is getting at the Hebrew yimas et lavav echav, um, lest the hearts of his brothers, his comrades, be lessened or flag.
Yeah, what's
Yeah,
the last word there is?
echav is comrades or brothers, but lavav is heart. If I
Right,
highlight it, you'll see that.
but the last word too, what is that?
Oh yeah, and that's
Heart.
again ki levavo. Yeah,
Yeah, there it is.
like his heart.
Right.
Yep. No, this translation is very abstract. It's
There's
not going
another
word by
level
word.
too. Yeah,
There's 3 instances of the word heart in this verse. You're absolutely
yeah,
right.
yeah, lots of heart going on.
Well, this is an interesting idea of the heart being the center of this. And I think maybe this might be something worth mulling over some more to really, because it's getting at this idea in the legal arena today. Conscientious objection, one of the big questions is sincerity. And is it coming from the heart? Is the belief, is it a head thing that's just this intellectual idea, or is it something deeper that goes to the heart? And so I'm really liking this play on words a lot here. Well, I think this is probably a good time for us to go to our next text because it's going to hit on some of these on some similar issues, and so or it's going to be in, maybe you might describe it as being a application of this text. And so this next text is Judges 7 verses 2 to 3. And Lex, I put a link in the chat. I don't know if you saw that.
Yep,
If you
getting it set.
Awesome. And here it says, and I'll read right before this. I'll go ahead and start with this. Yeah, early next day, Jerubbaal, that is Gideon, and all the troops with him encamped above in Harod, while the camp of Midian was in the plain to the north of him at Gibeah Moreh. God said to Gideon, "You have too many troops with you for me to deliver Midian into their hands. Israel might claim for themselves the glory due to me, thinking, 'Our own hand has brought us victory.' Therefore announce to the men, let anyone who is timid and fearful turn back, as a bird flies from Mount Gilead." Thereupon 22,000 of the troops turned back, and 10,000 remained. Now, I'm going to tell you the rest of the story, which is that they continue to reduce the numbers down smaller and smaller, and finally a very small number are left. And then through a mix of divine hand and a little bit of trickery, they win the battle. So to me, it's interesting having this story, considering it in light of the Deuteronomy story. We're seeing a little bit more, and again, it goes down to 300 as the final number. And so this does seem to be amplifying this idea that biblical wars depicted here is all about God. It's all about what God is ordaining, what God wants to have happen. And so there is this tension, though, between the pragmatic issues of warfare and also this idea that war for the Israelites is understood as about God. What I especially find interesting here, though, is the fact that the numbers dropped so fast. You're starting with 32,000, 22,000 leave, 10,000 remaining. So that would be 2/3 of the troops. It's hard to imagine this level in any modern force, if you asked who wants to go home, there would be, if they knew they were in trouble for saying so, of course, there'd be many that would say, yes, I want to go home. Would it be 2/3? I doubt it. And so this to me is a really extraordinary story. So Anyway, what thoughts do we have about it, and especially in comparing it to what we have been looking at in Deuteronomy?
I'll just say that as a person in the military, anytime they asked you, does anybody want to go home? You knew not to say anything because it was not going to go well for you.
That is true. No, volunteering, anyone who's in the military, you never volunteer for anything. Never, ever, ever. By the way, Lex put in the chat very Sparta-esque with 300. And then note 22,000 is to a person familiar with the alphabet and its 22 letters, an alphabet of thousands who left it first.
I think it's interesting in saying something that that they're willing to admit here in this story how many of the Israelites at this point are openly saying, I'm fearful and soft-hearted. I'm out of here. We always think about, the embarrassing moments of scripture as being the ones that are probably the most likely to be genuine, because it's not necessarily, obviously a a compliment to the bravery of the Israelites at this point to say, yeah, 2/3 of our guys were too fearful and just wanted to head out and get out of here. Even though they win the battle at the end of the story, it's starting the story out in this kind of weird vein. And so you've got to think that maybe there is something really real to this scope of this number at this point. Otherwise, they would have said, oh, just a few left. But a whole bunch of them ended up, lapping the water like the dogs. That's where they all left there. But no, they're really just saying, yeah, 2/3 of the people just didn't want to fight and headed home.
Susan.
Hi, I came in a bit late, and I think that I'd like to know if we're accepting this as if it's being written as history instead of as a story that was told to make a point, because storytellers do tend to exaggerate,
Mm-hmm.
and you tend to use, as you're saying, the symbolism of certain numbers, and so and often, especially in religious texts, that they tend to exaggerate to minimize the human involvement and maximize the divine part of it. So I don't know if that's a factor here, because I really don't know. But when I hear this, that's what strikes me. Knowing stories, what storytellers tend to do, they may say 2/3 as a way of saying a lot.
Absolutely.
Instead of saying exact numbers.
Yeah, I strongly agree with you. Another factor is that we have next to no archaeological evidence of a Hebrew invasion of Canaan as is depicted in the Bible. And so there may have been warfare, there may have been Hebrew involvement in it. Did it look like this? Probably not. So I mean, one of the questions I would kind of taking what you're saying, kind of taking it a little further, would be I would love to know more about how the text of the book of Judges came to be. I've heard lots of theories, of course, the different theories, documentary hypothesis about how the 5 books of Moses came to be. I don't know anything about how Judges came to be, when it was written. Probably has a lot more to do with its time than the biblical era. So it's a great point. Well, the next text we're going to look at is from 1 Samuel. And that's in chapter 8, verses 10 to 14. And it's a very different kind of text. It's set at a different point in time. The book of Judges, of course, remember, is from a time period where that the Hebrew people are functioning as a theocratic tribal federation, for lack of a better word. So they believe that God has some kind of direct hand that's leading them through judges, through prophets, and the final one, of course, was Samuel. But we have this point in time where all of a sudden there's this call, and it's from these tribal leaderships saying, you know what, we need unity. We need to stand up together. We need a strong leader. And Again, often bad things happen when people call for strong leaders. And so in the book of First Samuel, this text is basically Samuel reporting back to them from his message from God, stating his opinion, God's opinion about kings and why it doesn't go so well. So let's look at this. So Samuel reported all of God's words to the people who were asking him for a king. And he said, "This will be a practice of the king who will rule over you. He will take your sons and appoint them as his charioteers and riders, and they will serve as outrunners for his chariots. He will appoint them as his chiefs of thousands and of fifties, or they will have to plow his fields, reap his harvest, and make his weapons and the equipment for his chariots. He will take your daughters as perfumers, cooks, and bakers. He will seize your choice fields, vineyards, and olive groves and give them to his courtiers. He will take a tenth part of your grain and vintage and give it to his eunuchs and courtiers." And it goes on from there. Of all the things that these kings that you want so badly, there's a cost to kings. There's always a price tag. And he's warning them about the dangers of kings. Now, what is interesting, though, is, and how this is framed, a lot of this is speaking actually of either conscription into the royal household to serve in various ways, or conscription into the military. When it speaks of charioteers and riders and outrunners for the chariots, this is talking about people that are being taken to be part of the king's army. And so this is a fascinating text. I always find it also so interesting that despite the fact that First Samuel says kings are a bad idea, kings are a bad idea, yet through most of the rest of Jewish history, there's this longing for, oh, I wish we had a king like David. I wish we had the good old days with those kings. I'm not so sure about that. First Samuel makes it really clear, kings not such a good thing. So what thoughts might we have taking this text into the conversation? Are there any thoughts that we might have that might jump out at us from here?
Well, nobody's ever wanted to pay taxes,
True.
right? That's just been all of human history, from what I can see. People will agree to do it for certain reasons, but he's just saying, yeah, you know that you have to do this, right? I mean,
Mm-hmm.
I think like one thing about this little part of the story is that first Samuel he's telling them what God said first, right? So I mean the people asked for a king, he goes to God, God says this stuff, and then he tells them that what God said, right? I mean, trying to dissuade them because I mean, Melech HaOlam, like, you already have a king, remember? Like, I'm like, am I not the king? Sort of like thing, and then all this other stuff to further dissuade. It's really interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Right, there's a difference between the divine taking the um the sons to do certain duties and the daughters to do certain duties, and versus a human person king who will do this. And it's, you know, it's taking the people who are crying out for a king, who I'm guessing tend to be the masses, rather than those who are already in a place of wealth, or the ones who want to be the king. The rich never get the draft, right? They're always able to buy their way out.
By the way, in the chat, Jamie said, this is starting to remind me of Baruch Spinoza's views, strongly opposed monarchies in general. Of course, the problem, I would say, I would agree with that, but I would also say the challenging thing is that we now know that democracies can also go full into imperialism and war just as easily as monarchies can. But I think at the very least in a democracy, there is some sense that you have to have at least enough of the people's consent to do things. Well, the last text we're going to look at today, and this one is not on Safari, so I'm going to pull it up from a different source real quick. I say that is Lex. Do you know is First Maccabees on Safari?
It is actually, but just give
Oh.
me the verses.
Yeah, chapter 3, verse 56.
Cool. I'm not sure that their translation is super good, but so what have you used for your translation?
I used Common English Bible.
Okay, Common English Bible 356, you said?
Mhm. So a bit of context here. We talked about this a moment ago, but this was in the early days, the Maccabean War. And what's important about this text is that Judas Maccabee, the text is depicting him as the ideal biblical warrior. And so I'm going to read just a little bit before that to put this in context a little bit. So it says, so then they blew the trumpets and gave a loud shout. Judas appointed leaders of the people in charge of thousands and hundreds and fifties and tens. In keeping with the law, he told all who were building houses or about to get married or were planting a vineyard or were faint-hearted to go home. Then the army went on the march and camped south of Emmaus. So it's interesting here, and again, what we also know from history that his successor, Jonathan Maccabeus, undid this. He began having conscription be applied pretty unanimously. At this moment, I mean, bear in mind, there really wasn't any conscription. We're talking about a rebel army. And so what Judas Maccabee is saying, basically, of this voluntary force that's come forward here, I'm now sending some of them home. Why would he do that? To me, the best example is he's trying to fit the depiction of how he's supposed to be depicted. In other words, this is a movement that's trying to dig deep, saying, we have been denied our right to be Jews on our own terms by the Greeks. So he's now doubling down on the Jewish stuff, including in this place, this reference to Deuteronomy. One thing that's interesting in Greek, I looked at this in Greek, and what's interesting in Greek, the word that was translated as faint-hearted, and again, First Maccabees is written in Greek. The word in Greek was often translated simply as being cowards. And so it has a much more pejorative feel than how it would be in the text was in Deuteronomy and Hebrew. In Greek, it's much more those who are cowards go home. In fact, just for fun, I plugged in the Greek text into an AI translation thing, and that's literally how it said. And the cowards need to go home, which are super interesting how it was framed.
What was the Greek word? I'm just like geeking out and curious.
That's a great question.
If it's not right next to you, don't worry too much about it. But
yeah, I don't have it handy. I should have. While we're talking, I'll look it up.
I didn't mean to derail. I'm sorry.
Oh, you're fine. Yeah, I know I found the Greek text on Wiki, so like the Wikipedia's the wiki source thing, but yeah, I don't have it hand. Yeah, shucks. That's when I do this again, we'll dig into that. So what do we think about the use of this text? Why, and especially why, there later on we see in First Maccabees concerns about pragmatic, like why we shouldn't be too literal about Torah. For instance, there's one passage that talks about the fact that in the past we were attacked on Shabbat and we just sit there and be defenseless, but we learned our lesson. We now fight. So we see by First Maccabees a certain level of flexibility in observing Torah for higher principles. And yet also still this deep concern about not letting this deep concern about not getting too far away from Jewish teachings. And so I find that super interesting here, that at this point in time, this pragmatic concern about having enough troops is not being, they're saying, no, we have to listen to principle. Later on, in other contexts, it's quite different.
Got it.
Oh, yeah, in the chat, Adrienne says, coward is from coward, based on kata tell, to tuck, tell, and run, as opposed to kur, similar sounding but very opposite. Ooh, interesting. Thank you, thank you. So anyway, these are the main texts we have to work with. There are some other possibilities that we could have talked about today. I was tempted to look at texts involving more generally civil disobedience. I'm thinking about the Hebrew midwives and the Exodus story. There are some other examples. Those weren't necessarily directly tied to the idea of war itself. So as far as conscientious objection itself to war in some way, or an exemption of it, these texts are the main ones I could find. Now, I will mention there are a lot of Talmudic texts, commentary texts, and again, I'll have links to those they'll be sharing in the resources page you'll be getting after this. But most of them use kind of similar analysis of that Deuteronomy text that we talked about a second ago, of either saying it's directly related to fear itself or that it's related to sinfulness. And it's the modern commentators who tend to go more in the direction of, no, it's about pragmatism in the war, in the context of war, or it's about conscientious objection itself. So I think one of the challenging, oh, we do have in the chat now on the Greek word, delos, which literally means coward, timid, fearful, skittish, shy, timorous. Okay, excellent. And actually, reading those other synonyms, some of those do sound a little more like the Hebrew possibilities, kind of tied to that idea of soft-hearted. So I think some of those are potentially possibilities, but in other ways they're not. And I'm just going to be upfront to say one of my tensions with this text is, as someone who's worked with conscientious objectors who have faced serious consequences for their conscientious objection, I really don't like them being labeled as being cowards, because for many of them, it is would be a much easier path to accept their orders and do as they're told. And yet I can certainly understand from how the text, its context, its original meaning, why it has the loaded imagery it does. So I think for our last bit of time here before we move on to our next session, I think let's have a little bit of conversation about this question of how are the fearful, how are those with scruples, how are they being framed in these texts, and what can we do with that framing? Should we push back on it somehow? Should we lean into it? I think there's a lot of possibilities, but what should we do with this text, given it is what it is? What do y'all think?
And now you're referring to all the texts we looked at, or like just the most
Yes,
recent?
yeah,
Okay.
all of them.
So I'll put that question in the chat.
Awesome.
But a thought that I had is, parsing out whether something is the head or the heart or whatever. I mean, I think that these are, now that we modernly know more about how our brain works and how our bodies work, and yet we're still mystified scientifically as to what makes any human individual the unique person that they are. That it seems to me very strange that that we have to get hung up on these ideas of conscience, of not just being able to say that every human is a unique individual creation, and whether it's their head telling them ethically not to do something, their heart telling them that they're tender-hearted and they're incapable of doing something. It just seems to me so obvious to say that there are just so many different humans on the planet, that we can't expect us all to be identical, and that we need to have, space and room for people, for whatever reason or purpose, to say, I can't, raise up arms against another human. That ought to be logical, I think. And so why it's not logical to me just seems very, very strange. And why we would, although obviously, I love looking at Jewish texts, but why we would need to be going back and parsing this to be able to say, as a modern person, I support any fellow human who doesn't want to hurt another human. I find that all interesting. There you go.
Yeah, I like how you've also mentioned earlier about what we now know about humans, how our bodies work, how our emotions work, how that it's, what we might have at one point framed as being a character trait. Oh, someone is fearful. Well, that really at the base level means their brain is being triggered in this way, and these chemicals are firing off, and it's much more complicated than that.
Yeah, I just looked up the Greek, because it is got the DEI word, so this is the root of the word God, and is it about fear of God? But it's like the opposite. It means faithless, or without faith, or without God. But it's interesting because in this particular case with this text, it's God who's turning the people away and saying, I want you to go home, instead of the people turning God away. So it's like they're without God, but because God has sent them home.
Mm-hmm.
So they're with God in the decision to leave, but they're not as part of God's army, if you want to call it that, because they have been dismissed, excused.
I do think in all of these texts too, I do think one of the tensions within these texts, but also in the context of the military and in the context of the Jewish community more broadly, is this tension between the individual's rights and responsibilities and that of the community. And I find it, like this text in particular, well, so the Deuteronomy text, our first one, really is, to me, it functions in two ways. It's designed in one sense to protect certain people who, for various reasons, we want not to take a chance on their lives being cut tragically short before they get to enjoy the benefits of these things that they've done, these relationships they have, or the sense of that harm would come to the individual who's forced to fight, who their heart isn't in it. At the same time, all of these things are also potential battlefield distractions. And I'm thinking about, and I've worked in my legal work, I've worked with a lot of combat veterans. And one of the hardest things that often happens for many combat veterans, and this has been a part of military history forever, is life back home continues onward. And life back home can get kind of messy. And life on the deployment gets messy. And so the number of people who have affairs while on deployment, stuff happens. This is the nature of life. And so to me, to some extent, these instructions of Deuteronomy also just feels like it's a way of saying, we want to, for the mission's sake, not just for the individual, but for the mission's sake, we want people who are fully devoted to the mission. In fact, I have one of the commentaries. I'm going to read just a little snippet of, because it was, let's see, where was it real quick? It was, okay, so this was also from Mishnah Torah, Kings and Wars, starting 7:15. I'm going to read a little. I'll go and read this whole thing. It's not too long. To whom does the phrase, "Is there a man who is afraid or faint-hearted," refer? The phrase should be interpreted simply as applying to let me jump ahead. So once a soldier enters the throes of battle, he should rely on the hope of Israel and their savior in times of need. He should realize that he is fighting for the sake of the oneness of God's name. Therefore, he should place his soul in his hand and not show fright or fear. He should not worry about his wife or children. On the contrary, he should wipe their memory from his heart, removing all thoughts from his mind except the war. Anyone who begins to feel anxious and worry in the midst of battle to the point of where he frightens himself violates a negative commandment. As it is written, Deuteronomy 23, do not be faint-hearted, do not be afraid, do not panic, and do not break ranks before them. Furthermore, he is responsible for the blood of the entire Jewish nation. If he is not valiant, if he does not wage war with all his heart and soul, it is considered as if he shed the blood of the entire people, as Ibid 28 states, quote, let him go home, lest he demoralize the hearts of his brethren like his own, unquote. Similarly, the prophetic tradition explicitly states, cursed be he who does God's work deceitfully. Cursed be he who withholds the sword from blood, Jeremiah 48:10. In contrast, anyone who fights with his entire heart without fear, with the intention of sanctifying God's name alone, can be assured that he will find no harm, nor will bad overtake him. He will be granted a proper family in Israel, goes on to all these benefits that this person would get. I bring that reading up because it really frames it from the standpoint that this is about, in some ways, it is rooted in pragmatic concerns for the mission as a whole, for the unit as a whole. And so I do appreciate this about the Torah text, that we're seeing this tension. We're seeing the tension of the individual and the communal need. But even in the midst of the existential level threats that the nation may be facing, there was this recognition that even in these circumstances, there needs to be exemptions to the rules of conscription. So. Well, any final thoughts that we have on any of these texts we looked at today, or anything that's bounced that has sparked thoughts for you from what we've talked about thus far? Well, before we go on our next break, I'll mention that our next session, we're going to be talking about, shifting gears quite a bit. We've talked about history. We've talked about the text at stake, Jewish text. We'll next be talking about the practice of conscientious objection. We'll be talking about it in the context of the modern state of Israel. We'll be speaking of it in the United States, in the context of both members of the military currently in, people who might be drafted in the future. And finally, we're going to talk a little bit about the broader idea of conscientious objection and how it might play out in our lives in other ways. So let's take let's do like a 5-minute break real quick, comfort break. When we come back, we'll get going. We'll go and start the next block in 5. We won't wait till the top of the hour just because this next bit, I think it's going to be nice to have a little more time for it. So we'll get going in 5 minutes. And in the meantime, if you have any thoughts, questions, comments, whatever, put them in the chat and we'll get started in just a few minutes.